thing, do you think the UK should follow suit, at least in that move?
What I think the UK should do is what the US has done. The US, well, let me take one step back. To the extent that there's any legal ambiguity about whether this money can be confiscated, the way you resolve legal ambiguity is to make law. That's what you do for a living. You make laws. And so the U.S. To address this possible legal ambiguity, passed something called the Repo Act. The Repo Act was passed along with the $61 billion aid package, and they've now resolved any legal ambiguity, and the United States government has the right to confiscate the money. What I would suggest is done here is some version of the Repo Act, where to the extent that there's any legal concern, that you legislate away that legal concern so that it can be properly done here. And by having the United States and the UK coming to that decision, it puts more pressure on the EU to do the right thing in the end.
That was one very quick final question, because you talked about the idea of getting everybody together to take this action. Given and I think you wrote about that in your article, so the US, Canada, Japan, the EU and Australia all need to unify around this. How likely is that? How likely is that to happen?
Well, I mean, it ended up happening. So when I started the Magnitsky Act campaign in 2012, it was only the U.S. who did it. And by the way, what I'm talking about with confiscating the reserves shouldn't take us 10 years like the Magnitsky Act. But I started with the U.S. and I was just one man. I was not the whole consensus of the world as we have right now. That's something that needs to be done. But eventually we then got Canada, and then we got the UK, and then we got EU and Australia. Everybody will, it's the only logical, moral, rational thing to do. Everyone will come to the proper decision in the end, but it just takes some international pressure, diplomacy, reality, financial reality of the situation. And so I think it's likely to happen, but it's not going to happen unless we push for it. And that's, thankfully in this fight for the confiscating the reserves, it's not like just one man pushing for it. But we have a lot of people that believe this is the right thing to do.
And just to clarify, though, that you do think it needs to be done multilaterally.
It has to be done multilaterally because then it comes back to the issue which you've just raised, which is if one country does it, it does create a perception that that's not a safe country if another country hasn't done it.
Can I just say you're a complete inspiration for all of us who are campaigning for change in all sorts of campaigning spheres. So thank you very much. In your evidence to the committee, you spoke about how we can seize Russian state assets, but I wanted to look at assets owned by sanctioned individuals. The UK has frozen £22.7 billion worth of assets owned by private citizens and entities, but legally we don't have the tools to confiscate them. What measures would you suggest to confiscate those personal assets? Should we look at Canada's Special Economic Measures Act or something like that?
Well, I have a lot of experience in this area coming back to the Magnitsky case. So in the Magnitsky case, my lawyer, Magnitsky was killed. He was killed for uncovering a $230 million government corruption scheme. We traced the $230 million to many different countries. We then would file criminal complaints with the law enforcement authorities of those countries to freeze and confiscate that money. And the crime took place in 2007, and we're still involved in criminal or assisting different law enforcement authorities in criminal litigation in 2024. And so what I've learned from this process is that when you're going up against an individual using the legal system, which I think has to be done, it's an extremely cumbersome, time-consuming process. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. What I'm saying is that if we're looking for financial relief to Ukraine now, the Russian government has committed the crime. They've committed a crime of aggression. We have custody of their money, and we can confiscate their money, and it's all very clear. When it gets to an individual, the big problem is that the individual has property rights, and I don't think we should start confiscating individuals' money without going through a proper legal process. And the problem with those individuals' property rights is the first thing you have to prove is that individual was somehow formally connected to the Russian government, and therefore there is some responsibility. And then proving that, and then you have to go through the rest of this process. I think that should be done. I think the oligarchs who are supporting the regime should have their money confiscated, but I think that's a longer-term process. I don't think we should ever unfreeze that money, but I think that the resources required to litigate that will be large, and I think that's something that needs to be thought about separately. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but I'm saying that in terms of the emergency that we have on our hands right now, the 80% of our efforts should be towards confiscating the state money, and then we could leave the other money frozen until we can figure out how to go about getting it.
As of the 23rd of February, 1,702 individuals and 298 entities have been subject to UK sanction. But there are many companies and individuals supporting Russia's war in Ukraine that have not been sanctioned. These include both Russian officials and oligarchs. If the government expanded the sanctions regime, who are the first people that they should target?
So what I would say is so we were just looking at this. Let me just get the list out. So the U.S. government did a project in 2017 where they asked I think it was the Treasury Department to come up with a list of who the Russian oligarchs were who were closest to Putin. And it was sort of an official legal assignment. The Treasury Department came up with a list of 96 individuals. It's a published list. And of that list, we actually in the UK have sanctioned 57. The US has only sanctioned 30, and the EU has only sanctioned 25. So we've done better, which is good. When I didn't know this until I got these numbers yesterday. So that's good, but that leaves us with 36 of these people not sanctioned. So what I would say, it's very easy. Let's get the list that the U.S. has produced. I mean, we could produce our own, but let's get the list that the U.S. Treasury has produced. Let's go down the list. Let's look at all the 36 people who have not been sanctioned, and if on the basis of the criteria that exists for the sanctions program for the invasion of Ukraine, we should then apply sanctions to them if the criteria applies. I think that would be the simplest, most broad way of doing it. I don't want to throw individual names out here today because I haven't done the research, but that's where I would start.
Let's hope 36 people are a bit worried right now.
Well, yeah, good. We're on Parliament TV, so...
In 2022, the government introduced a requirement for foreign businesses owning land or properties in the UK disclose their true owners and are registered overseas entities. It's how we found out that Igor Shuvalov, a sanctioned member of Putin's inner circle, owned 2 flats across the road from the Ministry of Defence, which were worth about £11 million. But there's still a loophole because anyone who controls an offshore company can continue to hide the ownership of that trust. Do you agree that we need to close the loopholes so that the legislation also targets trusts?
Absolutely. There's no reason. So transparency or sunlight is the best disinfectant, and much better than any government regulation or anything. If everybody knows who owns what, then we can, public can then be upset about all this type of stuff. Any loophole which allows transparency not to exist should be closed, and that's a great example. And there's probably a few other of these types of loopholes where people can continue to hide their ownership, and we should have none of that here. This should be a hostile environment for criminals, money launderers, dictators, and other people. It's not. There's plenty of legitimate people in the world who can come here, spend their money, bring good things to this country. We don't need the criminals.
I've
got another question, but I realise I've been going on for a bit, so... Sure, I've got one last question. To crack down on sanctioned individuals keeping money in the UK, the defence think tank RUSI has suggested that we create tripwires. That is where you create a new offence that you would then judge these oligarchs to have committed. Do you think that's a sensible way forward?
Well, I'm not familiar with the details of the proposal, so I don't want to comment on that, but I do want to comment on one thing which is really important, which is that one of the things which I learned about from all of the work we did on the Magnitsky case is that there's a whole sort of ecosystem of what we call enablers. These are people who, lawyers, accountants, trustees, company formation agencies, PR firms that work on behalf of bad people to help them launder their money, hide their money, and continue to manage their money when it's laundered and hid. And one of the things which, and I think that when we're talking about the amount of money that's been frozen in the UK, I think the number you mentioned was 23 billion. That's a drop in the ocean of how much money is actually accumulated that belongs to people who have done bad things. And the reason that's a lower number than the real number is because a lot of the money is hidden. Most of the money is still hidden. How do we unhide that money? I have an idea, and I've been talking about this since the war began, and that is that if we were to put a provision in law in the next iteration of the sanctions law, which said that any accountant, lawyer, trustee, etc., who worked for a sanction, an individual who was sanctioned, would have a duty of law to come forward to the government and share information about the ownership of assets of the sanctioned individual. If you take the poachers and turn them into the gamekeepers, all of a sudden that number of 23 billion will probably go to 230 billion. And it would probably cause any future lawyer, accountant, etc., not to want to get involved in this thing unless they knew that their clients were proper, legitimate individuals.
Thank you very much. I think that we've talked about sanctioning state-owned assets, but isn't it one of the features of the Putin regime that a lot of state-owned assets were actually taken out of Russia under the safekeeping of particular oligarchs, and there was a big battle between the old oligarchs and the Putin-affiliated oligarchs to have control of a lot of these state assets that are essentially being hidden in places like London. But under so effectively the individual owned assets aren't really individually owned at all. I mean, they are basically extensions of the state, and Putin would expect them to be returned to him if he wished to use them in any way. Doesn't this dissolve, for all intents and purposes, the distinction between individually owned
I really like these bras. I have 4 of them now.
and state assets?
I normally wear 34 double D.
It's
Well, hundreds of people.
we've done the work, and we estimate that
I always
between,
knew I was.
the year 2000 and 2024, Putin and the top 1,000 officials have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state, and Putin doesn't keep any of his money in his own name.
Tour reporter
Money is
Yasmin
stolen
Rodriguez
by
explains tonight why
trustees and oligarchs and so on. And so that money should be immobilized for sure. There's no question. The only issue is it's a much cleaner legal case to go after the state's money than it is to unpack that. And I do believe in property rights. You can't just broad brush and say that person is Russian, therefore their money should be confiscated. No, I think that's wrong. We can't do that. That would upset. Coming back to your original question, that would upset financial markets, and people thought that they're just by being born in a country or having a connection to a country that does something bad, that would put all their money at risk. I mean, everybody has property rights and legal right to represent
A
themselves,
teacher
but
has
I do
resigned, and Wake County
You
Schools
actually
says
have
it
to
is
have
making
carnitine
changes to how it.
for proper neuronal
trustees
development.
for
Specifically in autism, they found
that the money being held is effectively the money that belongs to the Russian state, and that the legal process should absolutely begin to try to take that money away from them. But I'm just saying that it's going to be a very long, hard road in terms of dealing with the emergency, the current emergency, and we shouldn't expect any financial results. Those financial results are going to come a decade from now if properly litigated, not today.
Human rights, rule of law, very important for individuals.
In February 20...
What we've got here is effectively a criminal enterprise.
In February
which
2023...
has stolen assets from, you could call it the Russian state, I might say the Russian people, to use in this web of arbitrary behaviour and criminality, of which the oligarchs are the most obvious examples. How do we overcome rights that are clearly there for a very good reason, human rights, property rights, rule of law, to deal with this obvious laundering that's going on? And we'll answer that, and then there's another issue I want to raise with you.
Well, I mean, I think that the laws are actually in place to do something here.
Proceeds of crime?
The unexpected wealth orders, etc. And again, I've got very, very direct experience in this area, and a very unfortunate experience in this area, which is, as I mentioned, the Magnitsky case, the 230 million, we traced all the money. The largest share of the 230 million came to the UK. And whenever we found money going to the country, we'd then file a criminal complaint